I hope you enjoy my history and lore video on the Tomb Kings. If you would like to view more videos like this in future, please remember to like and subscribe to my channel for weekly content. Every little helps, and you, right now, could make a difference by clicking subscribe. Along with leaving a comment, it's the best way for you to show your support. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy. Tomb Kings. The ancient kingdom of Nehekhara was at its most powerful when other tribes of men were still primitive and savage, about 2,500 years before the coming of the barbarian hero Sigmar Heldenhammer. According to myths and legends of Nehekhara, in the time before men, gods walked the world as mortals. It was believed by the ancient Nehekharans that when the desert gods first arrived in the Great Land, they fought the armies of vile demons and foul spirits that lurked there in great battles that lasted for many centuries. In numerous inscriptions, carved on the tombs and monuments of ancient cities, it is written that Settra, the sun god and king of Nehekharan pantheon, led the final battle against the dark powers. Riding a resplendent golden chariot, he drove the darkness back. Even the most powerful demon recoiled from the touch of his divine light. Settra and the desert gods were victorious, and the evil ones retreated north to escape destruction. Legends tell that the great desert gods then transformed the land into a verdant realm and ruled there for thousands of years until the birth of the race of man. It is said that these people were so favoured by the heavens that Settra himself bestowed upon them the fertile land that would later be called Nehekhara. In exchange for their worship, the deities offered to protect and watch over those that dwelt within the great land. With the covenant made, the gods nurtured the people of the nomadic tribes, teaching them how to read, write and build great cities. Thus was a Nehekharan civilization born. Through the centuries of work and culture, Nehekhara, known to its people as the Great Land, was built into a powerful civilization. Its people built great cities out of white stone and carved marble. They constructed vast roads and fleets of ships to connect each city to its neighbours. Mighty kings, whose every whim was law, ruled the people. Vast armies of disciplined soldiers were raised and trained in the king's name, and those that invaded their cities were mercilessly cut down. Greatest of these cities was Khemri, the city of kings, and by tradition, whoever ruled it was considered the king of all Nehekhara. The other cities were each governed by their own king, though all were expected to show loyalty and pay tribute to Khemri. Together, these kings subdued the tribes in the surrounding lands, drove back the greenskin hordes that plagued the border, and ruled from the western deserts of Araby to the eastern Sea of Dread. At its height, the lands of Nehekhara had expanded and conquered the lands as far north as what is now known as the barbaric lands of the Empire, as far south into the primordial jungles of the Southlands, and even as far east into the foreboding Darklands. The king's armies marched across the world, subjugating all before them, and their vast fleets of galleys terrorized the great ocean. Though Nehekhara and its cities grew in size, wealth and influence, the kings thirsted for even greater power. To this end, they began the war upon each other. Over the following years, the crown of Nehekhara, a symbol of rulership over all of the Great Land, passed from king to conquering king. Dozens of kings have arisen and fallen during this time, so many that their names are not even remembered. But it is known that none had the strength to prevail or maintain their power for long. With every Nehekharan city turned upon each other, the Great Land was open to attack from invaders. The city of Liberus was completely destroyed by the scaled creatures that lurked within the southern jungles. Numerous greenskin hordes and human barbarian tribes descended from the northern border, destroying and slaughtering as they rampaged unchecked across Nehekhara. During this time, the Great Land was stricken with drought and plague. No single army, exhausted as they were from war, famine and disease, could hope to hold back the tide alone. But the arrogant and distrustful kings refused to put aside their differences to form a lasting alliance, bow the knee to another, or halt in their pursuit of domination over their rivals. The first great civilization of mankind stood on the brink of total destruction. That all changed with the coming of Settra. Of all the kings of Nehekhara, none could match the splendour, cruelty and arrogance of Settra, the newly crowned king of Khemri. He was a vain and egotistical man, and demanded not only the obedience of his subjects, but also the absolute adoration. However, Settra was no fool, and when he listened to his priest, he realized that only a leader who could command the respect of the gods would earn the full adulation of the people. To this end, King Settra, alone amongst all the kings of Nehekhara, paid homage to the ancient gods. Early in his reign, he ordered the restoration of temples and erected magnificent statues to be built in their honour. On the first anniversary of his coronation, Settra beseeched the gods to restore Khemri to its former glory and grant him the strength to conquer his rivals, sacrificing his own children in a grand ritual to show his commitment and prove his worth. The next day, the Great Vitai River flooded for the first time in several decades. With the waters, disease was washed away from Khemri, and the crop harvest was plentiful for the first time in living memory. This was seen as a sign by both the Nehekharan priesthood and the populace of Khemri that Settra was indeed chosen by the gods. So it was Settra that became the first priest-king of Khemri, a ruler who commanded not only the loyalty of his people and his legions, but one who also wielded the power of the gods themselves. Settra was an all-powerful king who had fought alongside his father's legion for many years before ascending to Khemri's throne. He was a ruthless warlord, and his keen tactical and strategic sense was matched only by his courage and martial skill. One by one, Settra brought the other great cities of Nehekhara to heel, leading his legions from the front where he could slate his own battle lust and thirst for conquest. First, the city-state of Numus, known as the Scarab City, fell before his might. Then the port city of Zandri surrendered, and with every victory more warriors flocked to his banner. Before long, Settra commanded the largest and most devout army Nehekhara has ever known. Vast legions of battle-hardened soldiers marched across the land of Nehekhara, and no mercy was shown to those who would dare oppose his might. In time, all the kings were conquered, and Nehekhara stood unified once more. So began the golden age of the Tomb Kings. Few rivals emerged to oppose the great king, and those few who did were crushed mercilessly, either at his own hands or by his personal and imposing champion, Herald Nekaf. Settra's agents would root out and quell any trace of dissent and the merest hint of rebellion that would threaten the stability of their lord's realm. Soon, none dared to even think of defying the King of Kings. Thereafter, Settra reigned as the undisputed king of not just Khemri, but all of Nehekhara, and for many decades he suffered no challenge to his rule. Though Settra was a ruthless and tyrannical ruler, Khemri and indeed the whole of Nehekhara entered a golden age of prosperity and plenty under his iron-fisted rule. The war-ravaged cities were quickly restored, and many grand monuments were erected to not just the gods, but also to honour the Nehekharan's ever-expanding borders, repelling the many mutated monsters and savage barbarians that had sunk their claws into the great land during the time of strife. Yet Settra was not content with merely restoring the kingdoms of his ancestors. The armies of Nehekhara spread far and wide, conquering the surrounding lands and enslaving their tribes. Settra's war fleet ravaged the realms across the seas, and his armies brought the terror of the priest kings to many distant lands. Foreign cities fell, faraway lands were conquered, and vast riches were brought back to the great land from as far afield as the jungles of Lustria. Nehekhara reached the peak of its power and influence during the reign of Settra, and his name was feared across half the world. There was nothing that could stay Settra's hunger for war, nor his thirst for conquest, and for many years the armies of Nehekhara swept across the world. Settra's vast kingdom stretched far and wide, but for all his victories and accomplishments, the priest king was unsatisfied. It is said that in the 40th year of his reign, with his body beginning to show the first signs of old age and frailty, Settra stood upon the peaks of the Black Mountains, the very edge of his vast empire, and surveyed all that he had conquered. He then turned and gazed upon the distant lands that lay on the other side of the mountain and roared in anger. It was with bitter disappointment that Settra realised that even if he were to live 100 years, there would still be realms beyond his grasp. Settra simmered with rage, for he knew that one day he would be defeated, not by a mortal foe, not by any superior army, but by the cruel passage of time and his own morality. Settra knew that his dream of global conquest was unreachable in his immortal lifespan, and though the fires of ambition burned brightly within his heart, his body would wither and fail him before he could see his vision fulfilled. Worse, Settra knew that death might rob him of all that he had achieved, his lands, his people and his power. In his arrogance, he vowed that the grave would not claim him, and set in motion events that would forever change his kingdom. Settra became obsessed with unlocking the secrets of immortality so that he could rule over his lands for all eternity. In his quest for everlasting life, Settra founded the mortuary cult and demanded that his wisest and most powerful priest devote their efforts to discovering the secrets of preventing his passing. The priests of Khemri did as Settra bade them, and for years they brewed potions, recited incantations and travelled into unknown lands in search of the secret to overcome death. In their research, the priests learned much, and they used their powers to extend Settra's life far beyond its natural span. However, they could not halt the passage of time indefinitely. They were merely postponing the inevitable, while their lord's mortal body became ever more frail. The priests of the mortuary cult were naturally reluctant to reveal these limitations to Settra, whose wrath was legendary, and continued to search in vain for a way to accomplish this impossible task. The priests journeyed for many years throughout the world. They studied all aspects of death, and over the years they've learned much, and their powers grew. Using their arcane knowledge, they also extended their own lives as well. They learned how to preserve a corpse from decay until the art of mummification had become tuned to perfection. With the passing of the years, the hierophants of the mortuary cult had even begun to experiment with harnessing the winds of magic as well. Though they made incredible progress, it was to no avail. True immortality lay just beyond their grasp. Great was Settra's wrath for those the priest's magic kept him alive far beyond the span of any mortal man. They could not prevent his death. However, the mortuary cult gathered a vast lore of magical incantations and rituals, which they claimed could bridge the gap between the mortal world and the realm of souls. They believed that with the careful preparation and the proper incantations, it might be possible for the dead to return to life in imperishable bodies, though it may take another century to perfect and perform the necessary rituals. Left with no other choice, Settra commanded that a vast burial tomb be constructed for his body to rest within until the mortuary cult finished their work and he could be reborn into the eternal existence he so craved. As Settra lay dying, full of anger, spite and pride to his very last breath, the priests of the mortuary cult promised him a golden paradise that, upon his awakening, he would rule for millions of years. When the king perished at last, it was with the final curse upon his lips. Powerful incantations were intoned over his corpse, and he was embalmed in a great ritual. Preserved against decay, the body of Settra was entombed within a mighty sarcophagus in the heart of the majestic pyramid of shining white stone. The monument was so bright that it hurt the mortal eyes just to look upon it. The pyramid was vast, and it towered over the city of Khemri. It was the largest and most magnificent monument ever created in Nehekara, for no simple cairn would befit a king as powerful and mighty as Settra. All of his treasures, along with his most loyal servants and bodyguards, were also interred within his pyramid. Settra's mighty legions, which had carved out his realm at his behest, were arrayed deep beneath it in colossal tomb pits. Loyal even unto death, these soldiers were buried alive in preparation for the day of awakening, when Settra would arise and lead them to war once more. At the head of the funeral procession strode Nagash, Settra's most loyal servant. Mummified at the right-hand side of his beloved king, in order to send him into the next life. For thousands of years afterwards, the priests of Khemri tended the funeral flames outside the sealed tomb, nurturing Settra's immortal spirit with sacrifice and incantations in preparation for the day of awakening. No tomb before or since has ever had such powerful hieroglyphs or warding or incantations or protection heaped upon it. During this time, the priests of the mortuary cult continued to develop their understanding and magical incantations in hopes of finally unlocking the secrets of immortality and of bringing about the time of Settra's resurrection. Following Settra's death, many dynasties came and went. However, without Settra's stern control and merciless leadership, no single priest king had the ability to rule over all of Nehekara. Thus, The individual cities vied and competed with each other over riches and status. Though Nehekhara did not revert to all-out civil wars like the time of strife, skirmishes between neighbouring cities were not unheard of. During this centuries-long era, known as the Time of Kings, the borders of Nehekhara were as changing as the shifting dunes. What existed was a feudal state where power and territory was decided by strength of arms. A king was only as powerful as the size of his armies, and so vast legions were raised with each passing decade. Though the expansion of the Great Land did not proceed at the same pace as it had during the reign of Settra, every now and then a warrior king would extend his realm, either by conquering his neighbours or by pacifying some of the savage lands surrounding Nehekhara. Armies of highly disciplined warriors and fearsome chariots warred against the priest king's enemies. To the west, the crude desert nomads were subjugated, and their chieftains were enlightened by the great civilization of Nehekhara. To the north and the south, the priest kings fought many battles against tribes of greenskins, barbaric men, and crocodilian lizard warriors. These wars brought much wealth to Nehekhara, and slave gangs toiled like ants, hauling their prizes back to the necropolises. Gold was taken from the strongholds of the bearded mountain dwellers, precious jewels from reptilian temple cities, exotic stone from as far away as distant Cathay, and fresh slaves from the primitive lands to the north that would one day become known as the Empire. Almost the entirety of this conquered wealth was spent in raising larger legions of soldiers and in the construction of ever more elaborate tombs and monuments. All the priest kings of Nehekhara shared the same lust for worldly wealth and power, and had the same ambition to defy death and rule for all eternity. However, just as with Settra, none could escape death's embrace, so they maintained the mortuary cult in order to reawaken them after their passing. During this time, the power and influence of the mortuary cult grew. The first generation of priests, whose skills were comparatively rudimentary, died along prolonging their lives far beyond their natural span. They passed on their knowledge to the next generation, who exceeded them in both wisdom and expertise. In this way, the mortuary cult's skill accumulated until the fifth generation of priests discovered the secrets of binding their souls into their bodies and did not die. After long years of perseverance and endless research, they had finally unlocked the secrets of eternal life. And though they had not perfected the necessary incantations, the ability to awaken the deceased kings from the sleep of death was almost in their grasps as well. However, the priesthood, whose members had become known as the Lich Priests, were very careful to keep the secrets of their magical lore to themselves. They had gained unprecedented power and enjoyed a dominion over the lands in Nehekhara, second only to that of royalty themselves, and they were reluctant to give that status up. The Lich Priests reasoned that so long as the priest kings had need of the mortuary cult to reawaken them into the golden paradise, nothing would change and they could officiate in perpetuity. Whilst the Lich Priests continued to develop their lore of magical incantations, they witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, and still they did not die. However, as the centuries passed by, the Lich Priests began to discover the unpleasant difference between eternal life and eternal youth. Nehekhara became a society completely obsessed with death and immortality. Deities such as Jaff, the god of the dead, and Ursrian, the god of the underworld, became as wildly worshipped as Ptra, the god of the kings. Skulls and skeletons became common symbols of immortality and everlasting life, and such motifs were emblazoned on their shields, banners, and chariots of the priest kings' armies. Heroic warriors were rewarded not with riches and luxuries in life, but with the promise of mummification upon death and a chance of sharing in their lord's eternal rule. It was not just the culture of Nehekhara that changed as the mortuary cult grew in power. As the Nehekharans' obsession with death flourished, the architecture and landscape of the Great Land irrevocably changed as well. Every priest king demanded that his pyramid outdo the efforts of his predecessors in order to prove his superiority. Though none had the audacity to surpass the majesty of the Great Pyramid of Settra, ever bigger monuments were raised to honour the achievements of the kings. Titanic statues were carved to stand guard over their remains, keeping them secure through all eternity. Before long, all efforts of the people were expended in building and maintaining the necropolises. Necrotext directed the construction as Lich priests oversaw the mummification rituals that the priest kings believed would one day lead to their resurrection. Soon, lesser nobles demanded similar rites and had tombs of their own constructed beside the royal pyramids. Over centuries, as hundreds of royal lines and their armies were entombed, the shining necropolises of the dead outgrew the now meagre-looking dwellings of the living. No expense was spared in paving the path for immortality, and the splendour, wealth and power of Nehekhara was breathtaking to behold. However, none could imagine that all this majesty would be destroyed by a single man. The fall of Nehekhara and the tragic destruction of its people was brought about by the ambition of a twisted priest named Nagash. As the firstborn son of Ketep of Khemri, Nagash was destined to serve in the mortuary cult whilst his younger brother, Thutep, ascended to rule following their father's death. Nagash was an exceptionally gifted student, and due to his talents and heritage he quickly became one of Khemri's high priests, but this did not sate his thirst for power. Filled with pride and greed, Nagash coveted the throne held by his brother and set into motion a plot to seize the crown for himself. Nagash began to corrupt the religious incantations of the mortuary cult, and he gathered together a dozen like-minded acolytes, of which a cruel noble named Arkan was the foremost. One night, as the clouds covered the moon, Nagash murdered Thutep's bodyguard before entombing the young king alive within the great pyramid of their father. The next morning, blood still staining his hands, Nagash placed himself on the throne, and none dared confront him. The reign of Nagash was a time of terror for all the people of Nehekhara. The usurper king sought to increase his own power by means of devilish sorcery, a blasphemy that the people of Nehekhara felt certain would incur the wrath of the gods. Nagash had learned the art of dark magic from a cabal of shipwrecked dark elves, captured and imprisoned within his father's pyramid on the eve of his funeral. Nagash tortured the pale-skinned foreigners until they divulged the secrets of their mystical powers, and he proved to be an apt pupil indeed. After only a few years, Nagash had surpassed his tutor's powers, and he destroyed them in a deadly magical duel as they tried to escape. Nagash began to experiment with necromancy, combining his mastery of dark magic with his knowledge of death from the mortuary cult. He committed his findings into 9 accursed tombs, the Books of Nagash, the most powerful source of necromantic magic in the world. One of Nagash's chief successes was the creation of the cursed elixir of life. With it, Nagash had finally unlocked the secret of eternal youth. He allowed Arkan, his trusted vizier, and his other principal lieutenants to imbibe the elixir. It granted them immortality and incredible strength, but, unable to recreate the potion themselves, they were little more than slaves to Nagash's sinister will. To increase his power and maintain dominance over the land, Nagash ordered the building of a vast black pyramid. Whilst the populace of Khemri believed this just to be another burial tomb, it was in fact a structure that would channel and harness the winds of magic to Nagash's every whim. The pyramid became Nagash's obsession, and its construction quickly drained Khemri's resources, forcing the necromancer to wage war to capture building material and replenish his workforce. Nagash demanded great quantities of gold and slaves from other cities to be sent in tribute to Khemri. That which was not given freely was taken by force, and several cities were brutally conquered by Nagash. Marble the colour of midnight was brought from afar, and innumerable slaves toiled day and night for 50 years until the Black Pyramid of Nagash towered above all other monuments in the whole of Nehekhara. Such was Nagash's arrogance that he had built himself a tomb that dwarfed even the Great Pyramid of Settra. The broken corpses of countless slaves were built into its foundations, and mystic sigils of power were woved into the Black Pyramid's walls. Even in the baking desert sun, the pyramid was cold to the touch, and not even starlight reflected off its magic-saturated surface. Upon its completion, the winds of magic blew more strongly across Nehekhara, and Nagash's mastery of dark magic and necromancy increased tenfold. However, the tribute exacted by Khemri was so great that the poverty-racked cities of Nehekhara had begun to fall into ruin. Eventually, the other priest kings rallied against the tyranny of Khemri. They refused to submit to Nagash any longer, and they began to draw their plans against him. So began the War of the Dead. To face the defiant priest kings, Nagash used his infernal powers to raise a legion of skeleton warriors. This was the first time that the dead were made to walk at the will of another, and the horror of it caused many immortal soldiers to flee before the undead armies. City after city fell before Nagash, and though the living warriors in Nehekara fought bravely, every soldier who fell only served to swell the ranks of the undead. Nagash believed it was only a matter of time before the priest kings relented and bent their knees in supplication once more, but his arrogance was to prove his undoing, for he underestimated both their resolve and pride. After many long years, the remaining priest kings threw all their strengths and hopes into one final gambit, and the combined armies of 7 kings marched upon Khemri. It was not only flesh and blood warriors who besieged Khemri, for beside the priest king's armies strode towering statues. Faced with destruction by Nagash's sorcery, the mortuary cult had finally decided to take action and put their centuries of magical research into practice on the battlefield. In a grand ritual, they summoned the spirits of ancient heroes from the realm of souls and bound them into numerous statues that line the passageways of necropolises. The godlike Ushabti, towering necrolith colossi, and powerful Khemrian war sphinxes were awakened, ready to be directed to war. With creations such as these fighting at their side, the living warriors of Nehekara were emboldened, and they crashed into the undead legions with devastating force. After a titanic battle, Nagash's forces were defeated by the combined might of the army of the 7 kings. Khemri was besieged and then sacked. Nagash's immortal lieutenants, who had taken refuge in the cursed Black Pyramid, were dragged out of their sarcophagi into the sunlight one by one and were executed by the vengeful priest kings. However, Nagash managed to escape before the priest kings found his tomb thanks to the sacrifice of Arkhan, who stalled the attackers long enough for his master to flee. With a curse on his lips, Nagash vowed to turn the entire world into the kingdom of the dead, and travelled north to plot his revenge. For hundreds of years the priest kings continued to rule Nehekara, but the corruption of Nagash had forever tainted the land, and it never truly recovered. The individual city rulers had exhausted their populace in overthrowing Nagash, and they had now to contend with famines, civil wars and marauding barbarians from distant lands. The treachery of Nagash had also tarnished the authority of the royal lines, and it was not until several centuries later that a truly powerful king arose, Al-Qadazar, a ruler the likes of which had not been seen since the days of Settra, ascended to the rule of Khemri. Under his wise and charismatic leadership, Al-Qadazar bound the great cities under his rule, and Nehekara began to prosper once more. The treachery of Nagash was hard to forget, and since his reign of terror, the mortuary cult was watched closely. The Lich Priests were forbidden from deviating from their age-old law of incantations, which had remained unchanged for centuries. However, the lords of the city of Lamia hungered for more power over their rivals. They saw in Nagash's sorcery the means not to only dominate all of Nehekara, but also the chance to live forever and sever their dependence on the mortuary cult. To this end, they stole one of the blasphemous books of Nagash from the Black Pyramid, and over the course of centuries they secretly became adept practitioners of necromancy. The Queen of Lamia, Neferata, embraced the malign magic and used her powers to consort with demonic entities. She created a tainted version of Nagash's elixir, extending her life indefinitely, yet cursing herself for all eternity. Not possessing the skill or knowledge of Nagash, Neferata and her court were struck by an unquenchable thirst for mortal blood. Lamia had become the birthplace of the vampires, fell creatures whose individual strength and unholy power were greater than that of a dozen men. Fearful that necromancy would bring about the wrath of the gods, King Al-Qadazar made a war on the tainted vampire queen. Al-Qadazar gathered legions from every other Nehekaran city and forged them into a single massed army that he led against Lamia. Thousands of chariots raced across the land ahead of vast regiments of archers, mighty phalanxes of spearmen, and battalions of giant war statues. Against such a host, not even the accursed vampires could prevail, and the power of Lamia was smashed. The Pale Queen fled, accompanied by those she had embraced into a cursed vampiric existence. Unbeknownst to the vampires, they had been guided by the implacable will of Nagash since their creation. Residing far away in his fortress, Nagashazar, Amid the mountains of the north cast of Nehekara, the arch-necromancer recognised the spawn of his own ancient evil and was gladdened by the corruption of Lamia. Here were worthy champions, their damnation a tribute to his dark genius. Drawing them to him, Nagash welcomed the vampires and they became his dark captains. Through them, Nagash began a new offensive against Nehekara, and the two sides fought numerous battles, the outcomes of which would pave the way for the necromancer's inevitable return. Beside the vampires came the dead warriors of a vast host, skeletons drawn from the ninths and cairns of the northern lands by the power of Nagash's sorcery. Nagash resurrected his trusted servant, Arkan the Black, who won many victories in his master's name. War assailed Nehekara for years on end, and the land was irredeemably scarred. However, Al-Qadazar was the greatest general of his age, and he led the unified army of Nehekara against Nagash's evil for all their long years of battle. Under his leadership, the living legions of Nehekara never yielded, and finally, during the Battle of the Golden Skull, the undead hordes of Nagash were repulsed from Nehekara. The vampires scattered throughout the world to escape destruction, and without their magic and leadership, their armies of skeletons crumbled. Nagash had been defeated. There was much rejoicing throughout Nehekara, though the evil sorcerer himself still walked the land. Such was Nagash's bitterness, so great the potency of his thwarted ambition, that he chose to end all life in Nehekara rather than see anyone else hold power over the land. He polluted the Great Vitai River, poisoning it until it turned thick and dark, tainting the lands that relied on its life-bring waters. Forever after, it was known as the Great Mortis River. Pestilence and disease ran rampant across the great land. Within a few weeks, those who had succumbed to the terrible plagues outnumbered the living. The city streets were choked with corpses, as fully 9/10 of Nehekaran population perished. Mourning for his lost people, Al-Qadazar sat upon his throne and his kingdom was destroyed. For all his skill at arms, he was powerless. Nagash's undead forces marched upon Khemri, brushing aside the city's plague-ravaged guard with impunity and walking past the fortress walls and siege barracks unchallenged. His skeleton warriors broke into Khemri's royal palace and dragged Al-Qadazar away to rot in a dungeon cell. For the first time in centuries, Nagash sat upon the throne of Khemri. However, Nagash did not linger in Khemri for long. Filled with insane visions of power, he returned to Nagashazar and began to cast the greatest and most terrifying spell ever conceived. He intended to enact the Great Ritual, a spell powerful enough to resurrect every corpse across the globe and bind them under his control. With them, Nagash would command an unstoppable army of the dead that he could use to conquer the entire world. To power his Great Ritual, he had consumed vast quantities of warpstone and summoned all the energies stored within this cursed Black Pyramid. As Nagash chanted within his fortress, the sky began to darken for hundreds of miles around and the ground shook. As his spell reached its crescendo, a great wave of power surged from the sorcerer's body, washing over the lands of Nehekara and stealing the life from everything in its path. Crops shriveled, and animals perished within seconds. The last people of Nehekara fell to the ground, their skin withering as if they had aged a century in the blink of an eye. Within minutes, there was not a single living creature in the entirety of Nehekara. Such was Nagash's execration of Al-Qadazar, who had thwarted his plans for so long, that he spared the imprisoned king to witness the horrifying fate that had befallen his former kingdom. Whilst the Great Ritual scoured the land of life, some things remained undetected far beneath Nagashazar. While Nagash was channeling his great spell, drunk with magical power and lost in dreams of triumph, Al-Qadazar, the last mortal king of Nehekara, was mysteriously freed from his prison below Nagashazar by a group of hunched, heavily cloaked rat-like creatures. A powerful blade, made of purest warpstone, was pushed into his hands, and the emaciated king stumbled into Nagash's throne room just as the sorcerer was reaching the climax of his mighty ritual. Through sheer force of will, Al-Qadazar summoned the strength to swing his baleful sword and cut the hated necromancer down. As Nagash died, the energies of his accursed spell spiraled out of his control and swept across the homeland. Alkidazar, filled with horror at the obscenities he had seen, and having witnessed the death of his beloved realm, then faded from history. As Nagash's powerful sorceries coursed across Nehekhara, countless corpses stirred and rose, animated solely by the dark will of the necromancer. With his destruction, their source of animus vanished and they fell like marionettes whose strings had been mysteriously cut. Nagash's foul magic also penetrated the tombs of the kings and reverberated throughout the charnel pits of the dead cities. However, protected and shielded to a degree by the wards and incantations placed upon their pyramids and necropolises, Nagash's spell affected the long-dead kings and their buried legions differently. After centuries of entombment, the stiffened corpses of monarchs and heroes awoke. The mummified kings rose from their resting places. Legions of skeleton warriors burst forth from their sand-filled tomb pits, ready to do their liege's bidding. Due to the incantations of preservation performed on their embalmed bodies, the Tomb Kings awoke from their long journey through the realm of souls, with their memories and faculties intact. They emerged from their tombs in horror, where the ancient kings had promised eternal life in a paradise where they would rule supreme. They instead awoke to find themselves clad in dissected flesh and rotten vestments, with their cities shattered, their lands desolate, and their kingdoms all but destroyed. Little more than ruins poking out from beneath the sand dunes. There had been countless kings during the long history of Nehekhara. The fires of ambition and pride that had driven them in life still resided in their ancient bodies, and they instantly set out to reclaim their empires as best they could. Kings who were great and powerful in life, who had reigned unchallenged for centuries, now awoke from death in a land where they were but one amongst hundreds. All believed the right to rule the land was solely theirs, and none would relinquish their perceived power. Dynasties that were built upon the shoulders of more powerful monarchs were forced to confront their founders, and there were long battles in the necropolises as king fought king. Undying legions arose at their command, and many tens of thousands of skeleton warriors were destroyed as the undead Tomb King struggled for supremacy. Of all the tombs and pyramids, only one remained silent and untouched by the fighting, the Great Pyramid of Settra the Imperishable. The wards heaped on the white burial monument had protected the mummified corpse of Settra from Nagash's tainted sorcery, and its occupants still slumbered in the sleep of death, oblivious to the turmoil of battle taking place outside the pyramid's walls. As the battle raged, the Lich Priests looked on. Their bodies, already extended far beyond their natural span, were unaffected by Nagash's spell. They had survived the rise and fall of Nagash, whose sorcerous powers they could not match, but it looked like the warring kings were going to destroy what remained of Nehekhara. The head of the mortuary cult, Grand Hierophant Katep, oldest and wisest of the Lich Priests, took it upon himself to restore order. As king smote king, Katep broke the seals of Settra's pyramid and began to recite the incantation of awakening. In Khemri, the battles between rival kings lasted for days before the tomb of Settra opened, and the mightiest of all the kings of Nehekhara strode out into the blazing sunlight at the head of thousands of his warriors. In undeath, Settra hungered for his domination of his fellow tomb kings, and he would suffer no rival to his rule. Settra waded into the carnage. His herald, Nekaf, stood as ever by his side. Together they led Settra's elite tomb guard and quickly carved a path through the rival skeleton legions. Settra struck down dozens of lesser tomb kings who stood against him, powdering their bones to dust and destroying them utterly. Not even Arkan the Black, with his command of dark sorcery, could prevail against Settra's strength of arms, and he was forced to flee Khemri. Before long, all the Tomb Kings bowed their heads to Settra the Imperishable, the undisputed ruler of all Nehekhara. Settra returned to his throne room and commanded the Lich Priests to explain to him why the awakening had gone awry and so long before the right and proper time. Settra's fury was great. His cities were in ruins, his treasures had been plundered, and much of his kingdom had been lost to foreign invaders. The golden paradise he was promised did not exist, and worst of all, it appeared as if the ancient gods had abandoned Nehekhara. Grand Hierophant Katep cowered before the outraged king and told the history of Nehekhara since his passing over 2,000 years before. As best he could, Katep told Settra of the spell that the foul Nagash had cast, cursing Nehekhara for all time. Settra listened with a barely controllable rage simmering within him. Once he had learned all he could from Katep, he commanded the Tomb Kings return to their eternal rest. The Lich Priests were given the duty of watching over the tombs and of awakening his vassal kings as needed. Settra vowed that he would stay vigilant, taking stock of the world and waging war as was his right. Never again would he slumber, lest his kingdom slide into ruin. Settra set about restoring his former empire without delay. In particular, he watched for the return of the hated Nagash, he who had cursed his realm, for he knew that the necromancer might yet reappear in the world, and that Nagash's sorcery could still threaten his immortality. So it was that Nehekhara became the land of the dead, and Settra the Imperishable renewed his rulership, which would become known as the reign of millions of years. Thank you for watching this Warhammer lore and history video on the Tomb Kings. I hope you enjoyed and learned a little more about the Warhammer world. If you would like to view more videos like this in future, please remember to like and subscribe to my channel for weekly content. Every little helps, and you, right now, could make a difference by clicking subscribe. Along with leaving a comment, it's the best way for you to show your support. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.